Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. This case takes us to a town called Arnold in Nottingham, right in the Midlands of England. It happened in 2011, but the story really starts about a decade earlier. Back then, Nottingham had been home to a seemingly happy family, the Bartlams. The Bartlam family consisted of Jacqueline Bartlam, who was more often called Jackie, and her husband, Adrian Bartlam. The two of them had been together for a while before they tied the knot in the year 2000. By that time, they already had a son. His name was Daniel, and he was 3 years old when his parents got married. A few years into the marriage, maybe around 4 or 5 years later, they had another child, a second son named Dominic. That made them a family of 4. And from the outside, they looked like everything a family should be. They had stability. They had love. They had enough financial security to send both children to private school, which says a lot about the kind of life they were able to give their boys. Daniel and Dominic had a solid upbringing, a structured, supportive home life. Nothing extravagant, but definitely secure and nurturing. But like many stories that start with happiness, things didn't stay that way. In 2005, shortly after the birth of their younger son Dominic, the marriage between Jackie and Adrian began to unravel. At first, it was subtle, small changes, tension, unspoken distance, and then eventually, it became clear that it just wasn't working anymore. That same year, Jackie and Adrian separated. They divorced. Jackie was given what appeared to be full custody of both children, although Adrian still remained a part of their lives. He would see the boys on weekends or every other weekend, but their primary caregiver, their home base, became Jackie. So now it was Jackie and her 2 sons, just the 3 of them starting over again. And for a while, they made it work. Jackie stepped into single motherhood with determination. It wasn't easy, but she kept going. She rebuilt their routine. And she kept her boys at the center of everything. Then, in 2008, another chapter began. Jackie went out one night, just a casual night out in town, and that's when she met Simon Mattis. He was single, he was charming, but more importantly, he was incredibly supportive. He understood what Jackie had been through. He respected her situation. And most importantly, he respected her role as a mother. Jackie quickly fell for him, and soon, Simon became a regular figure in their lives. He didn't live with them, but he was over often. He spent time with the boys. He treated them with kindness and consistency. He never tried to replace their father, but he played a role that resembled a stepfather. And in this case, that's how most people came to refer to him, as the stepdad, even if it wasn't official. From everything I could find, the boys seemed to get along with him. There were no glaring signs of tension. Sure, sometimes it can be hard for kids to adjust to a new adult figure in their lives, especially just a few years after a divorce, but nothing I found indicated there was serious conflict. If anything, it seemed like they welcomed him. So now, it was Jackie, her sons, and Simon, this new kind of family unit. They weren't perfect, but they were functional. They were happy. At least, they were. Until Easter weekend of 2011, Simon traveled a lot for work, and that weekend he happened to be working up north in Yorkshire. This wasn't unusual. Jackie was used to it by now. Their relationship wasn't the kind that needed constant texting or hourly updates. They'd usually just exchange one message a day, something brief, a check-in, just to let each other know they were okay. On Easter morning, Sunday morning, Simon sent Jackie a text. Just a simple one. Happy Easter. Hope you're all okay. What are your plans for the day? Jackie replied saying that she and the boys were going to, she believed, the boys' grandmother's house, and they were going to have a meal. That was how they were spending Easter. And that was about it for their communication, just a back and forth text, making sure each other were okay. And then Simon was going to come home the next morning. That following morning, Monday, the 25th of April, 2011, Simon got into his car, ready to make the drive back down to Nottingham. It was just another routine return from one of his work trips up north. But before he could hit the road, something on his phone caught his attention. It was a news article. There'd been a house fire in Nottingham. And not just somewhere in the city, the article specifically mentioned Arnold. Simon's heart jumped. That was Jackie's area. That was where she and her boys lived. As he read further, the details became more alarming. The fire wasn't small. The entire house had been destroyed, burned practically to the ground. It was described as devastating. Simon felt his chest tighten. It might have been nothing. It could have been another house. But he couldn't shake the worry. So he picked up his phone and sent a message to Jackie just to check in, just to make sure she and the kids were okay. He waited, an hour passed, no response, and then another article popped up. A follow-up report. This time, the reporters had narrowed down the location of the fire to a specific street, Georgia Drive. Simon's stomach dropped. That was her street. And in that moment, Simon said, he just knew. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't need to wait for authorities or reports. As soon as he saw the words Georgia Drive, something inside him told him exactly what had happened. It was Jackie's house. He had no doubt. When Simon finally arrived in Arnold, the scene confirmed everything he feared. Her house, the one he had visited so many times, where he'd spent quiet moments with her and the boys, was now reduced to a blackened shell. The entire structure was charred, police tape wrapped around what remained. Simon pulled up, parked, and without hesitation, ran straight to the officers on scene. He had to know, he had to hear it, even though he already knew the truth. And that's when they told him. His beloved Jackie hadn't made it out. One body had been recovered from inside the house. It hadn't yet been officially confirmed, but authorities believed it to be Jacqueline Bartlam. It was a moment of absolute devastation, but amid the smoke and the rubble, there was something else. A sliver of hope. Her children had survived. 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam had acted with extraordinary courage. He noticed the fire breaking out, and instead of panicking or freezing in fear, he'd immediately run to his 6-year-old brother Dominic. He grabbed his hand and led him out to safety. But he didn't stop there. Daniel then turned around and ran back into that burning house. He went back for his mother. He tried to reach her, to help her, but by the time he made it to her bedroom, it was too late. The fire was already consuming that part of the house. So he did the only thing he could do. He grabbed the family dog and brought her outside as well. And so that morning, as firefighters and neighbors arrived on the scene, they found Daniel standing there, a 14-year-old boy with his little brother and the family dog by his side. All three of them are alive. All three of them are safe. But behind them, the only home they'd ever known was disappearing in smoke and flame. And their mother, she was still inside. Daniel said that all they could do was stand there and watch as the house, their memories, everything they'd known was devoured by the fire. He stood there holding his 6-year-old brother's hand, their dog beside them, while their mother burned inside. Despite everything, Daniel was hailed as a hero. This was a boy who had just lived through the most unimaginable moment of his life. He'd watched his own mother die, watched his childhood home vanish, lost everything he owned, and yet he had still found the strength to go back into a burning house, not just to save his little brother, but to save the dog too. Everyone who heard what he did, police, neighbors, family, friends, they all praised him. Because that day, Daniel Bartlam had saved 2 lives. After the fire, police knew they had a difficult situation on their hands. Jackie, the only parental figure actively in the home, was gone. The house was destroyed. And now there were 2 young boys, and even the family dog, left with nowhere to go, with no one. So authorities made the decision to bring all of them, Daniel, Dominic, and the dog, back to the police station. Not only was this about giving the boys somewhere safe to be, but investigators also needed answers. A house fire that was intense, one that took a life, had to be thoroughly examined. They needed to figure out how it had started and whether there was more to the story than just a tragic accident. The first person they spoke to was 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam. They brought him into a quiet room at the station. Not an interrogation, just a conversation. Gently, they asked him if he could explain what happened. How had the fire started? What did he remember from that night? But what Daniel said was not what they expected. He told them that he had woken up in the middle of the night because he needed to use the bathroom. That seemed normal enough. But what happened next didn't. As he stepped out into the landing, into the hallway, he froze. There, standing in the darkness, was a masked man, a stranger, in his house. At that moment, Daniel said, he just stood still, staring, shocked. Then his eyes dropped to the floor, and he noticed something lying there, a hammer. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, Daniel said he bent down, picked it up, and hurled it at the masked man with all the force he could manage. The intruder panicked. According to Daniel, the man turned and bolted, rushing toward the landing window. He flung it open, jumped out onto the patio, then down to the driveway, and ran off into the night. The danger was gone. But Daniel wasn't thinking about that. All he could think was, how long had that man been in the house? What had he done while he was here? So Daniel started running through the rooms trying to find out if everyone was okay. His first stop was his mother's room. He opened the door, and what he saw changed everything. His mother was lying in her bed, and the bed, all of it was on fire, engulfed. The flames had already started to spread across the room. His mother was burning. 14-year-old Daniel was standing there, staring into the doorway of hell. And in that moment, he had to make a choice. He knew it was too late to save her. There was nothing he could do. If he hesitated, he might lose his little brother too. So he turned away, heartbroken, and ran straight to Dominic's room, grabbed his 6-year-old brother by the hand, and led him outside to safety. He had become the protector now. It took firefighters a little while to get there, and by the time they did, the home was already lost. They fought hard to contain the blaze, but the structure was almost completely reduced to ash. There was nothing left, nothing to salvage. Later, as part of standard procedure in a fatal fire, a special team of investigators was brought in, fire scene experts who could determine how and where the fire had started. And just like Daniel had said, their findings pointed to the origin of the fire being inside Jackie's bedroom, right on the bed. But this wasn't a case of an accident. It wasn't a forgotten candle. It wasn't a hair straightener left on by mistake. No, this fire had been started with petrol. Someone had poured gasoline across Jackie's bed, then set it alight. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a crime. And for the moment, Daniel's story seemed to support that theory. Maybe there really had been a masked man. Maybe it was a robbery gone wrong. Maybe he had killed Jackie before setting the fire to hide what he'd done. What was left of Jackie Bartlem's body was transported to the morgue. The fire had been so intense, so all-consuming, that the entire house was reduced to nothing but ash. And Jackie's body, it was the same. There was barely anything left. The damage from the flames was so extensive that she couldn't be identified by sight, not even close. She had to be identified using dental records. It was, of course, extremely unlikely to be anyone else. She was the only adult living in that house. But still, protocol had to be followed. And when the results came back, they confirmed what everyone already feared. It was Jackie. Once she'd been identified, a full autopsy was carried out, not just to determine the cause of death, but also to look for any further evidence that might explain what really happened in those final moments. And that autopsy changed everything, because it turned out Jackie Bartlem didn't die in the fire. Her actual cause of death was far more violent. She had been bludgeoned, hit repeatedly in the head, somewhere between 8 and 10 times. The weapon was believed to be a claw hammer. She had been murdered. And the fire, the inferno that tore through her home, destroying every trace of her life, was set afterward. It was meant to cover up the crime, to erase what had been done. When investigators sifted through the ruins of the house, or what little remained of it, they eventually found a claw hammer. It had been cleaned, clearly, but further forensic tests revealed traces of Jackie's blood. Someone had tried to wipe away what had happened. Someone had tried to make it disappear. But that wasn't the only hammer found in the house. Investigators also recovered a second one, a heavier, denser tool. A club hammer, bigger, heftier. That one had also been left behind. just lying there in the wreckage. And police believe that this second hammer, the club hammer, was the one Daniel had thrown at the masked man in his story. Now, everything was shifting. What started as a tragic house fire, a freak accident, maybe caused by something electrical, had become a full-blown murder investigation. The pieces were no longer lining up the way they first appeared. Police now had to ask a different question. Who had done this? Who was this masked man? This supposed intruder who had come into the Bartlam home, killed Jackie, and tried to cover it up in flames? To find answers, police turned to the neighborhood. They began going door to door speaking with every resident on Georgia Drive. Maybe someone had seen something, a figure in the night, a suspicious car, anything. But what they discovered wasn't what they expected. As investigators began speaking to neighbors, going house by house, they eventually came across one resident who remembered something unsettling. It had been around 1 a.m., just before the fire had started. This neighbor recalled hearing an argument coming from inside Jackie's house. At first, they didn't think much of it. Families argue, especially parents and teenagers. But as the voices got louder, they began to pay more attention. From what they could make out, the argument seemed to be between Jackie and her 14-year-old son, Daniel. They couldn't hear the entire exchange, but they picked up on one detail. Daniel was angry. And the reason? His mother had moved a pair of his shoes. Either she misplaced them, or he believed she'd lost them completely. But whatever had happened, it triggered something in him, something sharp and loud. So much so that he stormed out of the house into the backyard. And this wasn't just a quiet walk outside, he was yelling. In the middle of the night, Jackie followed him, or at least called out from inside. She was trying to calm him down, telling him to come back inside, to go to bed. The shouting continued for a while, rising and falling like waves, but eventually it stopped. The house went quiet again. For a few moments, it seemed like everything had settled, but then that same neighbor heard something else. The door to the Bartlam's backyard shed, it opened, and then it closed. Just a single sound. It happened maybe a couple of minutes after the argument died down, and then not long after that, screams. Loud, distressed, coming directly from the house. Now, you'd expect someone to act in a moment like that, to at least check, call someone, do something. But the neighbor didn't investigate, and they didn't call for help. Why? No one really knows. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they didn't realize how serious it was. But either way, those screams were never followed up, and that silence, that inaction, would soon haunt the entire street. Because by the next morning, Jackie Bartlam would be found dead. Her house burned to the ground, every shred of evidence incinerated, and the boy at the center of it all, Daniel, was now being hailed as a hero. The same boy who, just hours before, had been screaming in the garden over a pair of shoes. That same neighbor also told police something else that felt strange. When Daniel and his little brother Dominic came running out of the burning house in the chaos and panic of those early morning hours, the neighbor had noticed something about Daniel. He didn't look like a boy who had just woken up in a panic and escaped a fire. He looked put together, clean, too clean. This was a teenager who, by all accounts and even by the family's own admission, wasn't known for his personal hygiene. He didn't shower often, his hair was usually greasy. He wasn't someone who cared much about how he looked, but that night, he looked completely different. His hair was clean, washed, no grease. His clothes were fresh, not rumpled pajamas or sleepwear, but clean daytime clothes. And something about that just didn't sit right. Because if you've just woken up in the middle of the night to a house fire, if you're terrified and grabbing your little brother to run, you're not thinking about what you look like. You're not changing clothes. You're not washing your hair. But Daniel, he looked like someone who had just had a shower. And the timing of it all, the argument, the shed door, the screams, the polished appearance, it all started to add up into something much more disturbing. At this point, police were starting to view Daniel Bartlam in a very different light. The heroic teenager who had pulled his little brother from a burning house now raised questions. Was he really telling them everything about that night, or was he holding something back trying to shape the story in a way that protected him? Detectives couldn't ignore the inconsistencies any longer. So they brought Daniel back in. This time, it wasn't just a check-in or a follow-up. This was more serious. He was being treated as a person of interest. And as he sat there in the interview room, Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't break. He stayed calm, maintained his story from beginning to end. According to him, a masked man had broken into the house, set the fire, and vanished. He had nothing to do with it. He was innocent. But the police weren't convinced. Something about his account, his behavior, the timing, the little details just didn't sit right. And with mounting suspicion and pressure to act fast, they made a bold move. 2 days after the fire was discovered, police arrested 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam on suspicion of the murder of his own mother. It was a shocking turn. And at that point, it wasn't because they had concrete, irrefutable evidence. Not yet. What they had were fragments, circumstantial pieces that painted a disturbing picture when placed side by side. It was still mostly speculation, but the arrest gave them something valuable. Time. Time to dig deeper. And they wasted absolutely none of it. Investigators immediately seized Daniel's phone, his laptop, every electronic device he owned, and then they started going through it all piece by piece. What they found did not help his case. Daniel's search history raised serious red flags. He had been looking up things like how to get away with murder, browsing articles that laid out scenarios, some real, some fictional, about how someone might dispose of a body. They weren't instructional per se, but they covered options: burn the body, bury the body, hide the evidence. And Daniel had read through them, a lot of them. It wasn't just idle curiosity. He had also been obsessively researching true crime cases, not general interest pieces, but ones that centered around young boys who had committed acts of violence. School shooters, teenagers who had murdered classmates, parents, or friends in fits of rage. He dove deep into those stories, reading, analyzing, absorbing them. This wasn't a passing fascination. It was something more, something darker. And for police, this wasn't just a kid who liked crime documentaries. This felt like a pattern, like preparation. Because this interest, this behavior had crossed a line. It had gone far beyond a normal, healthy curiosity about crime stories. It was something else entirely. But what stood out most in Daniel's online activity wasn't just the sheer volume of crime-related searches. It was the very specific pattern. Daniel wasn't just reading about murder. He was fixated almost exclusively on cases where young boys had killed other people. And that detail caught the attention of professionals. When psychologists later analyzed this behavior, they believed it pointed to something deeper than just curiosity. They believed Daniel was trying to identify with those killers. He wasn't just learning about them, he was relating to them, trying to see himself in their actions, their choices, their paths. He was placing himself in their shoes, imagining himself as them. That's why he didn't care about other kinds of cases. That's why his interest wasn't broad or varied like most true crime enthusiasts. He was only drawn to the stories where he could see his own reflection in the killer. And it didn't stop there. As police continued digging through Daniel's laptop, they discovered he had his own YouTube channel. One of the first things they found was a video where he spoke directly to the camera, saying, "Hello YouTube, this is Daniel Doe here, and it's finally happened. I now have an iMac. I can now make bigger and better videos." But those bigger and better videos weren't harmless vlogs or gaming clips. The channel was almost entirely dedicated to posting violent, disturbing content, murder, and torture scenes from horror movies, television shows, and video games. Scenes filled with blood, cruelty, and pain. And while that might raise alarms for some, it still wasn't everything. Because alongside his digital activity, Daniel was also a prolific writer. He didn't just consume stories, he created them. He wrote stories. He wrote scripts. He wrote screenplays. And one of those screenplays would turn out to be the most disturbing discovery yet. Now, this script wasn't found easily. Daniel had deleted it from his laptop. It wasn't sitting in his documents folder. It wasn't out in the open. Police had to dig deep through system archives, through recovered files to find it. He tried to erase it, tried to hide it, which only made it more suspicious. The script itself was styled like a soap opera. Daniel was an avid fan of British soaps, Coronation Street, EastEnders, and he wrote this piece as if it were an episode of one of those shows, complete with new characters and dramatic arcs. And the main character? A teenage boy named Daniel Bartlium, a not-so-subtle stand-in for himself. In this fictional story, Daniel Bartlium was a serial rapist who eventually murders his own mother. Her name in the script, Jackie Bartlett. The names were barely changed. The storyline chillingly familiar, because in this script, the mother was murdered with a hammer. The body was then burned with petrol poured over her, and the whole thing set alight to destroy the evidence. It was a step-by-step recreation of what had happened to Jackie Bartlium in real life. And in the final act of the story, Daniel Bartlium gets away with it. But in real life, it wasn't looking like Daniel Bartlium was going to. So, police decided to confront Daniel Bartlium directly about what they had found, the disturbing screenplay, the eerie similarities to his mother's murder, the way he had used real names and details. And Daniel didn't exactly deny it. Instead, he tried to brush it off. He told them it wasn't anything deep or serious, that he was just writing a script, that using their names had nothing to do with reality. He said it was just easier that way, the names were familiar, convenient. He insisted that he and his mother had a good relationship. He said he was heartbroken over her death, that he would never do anything like this. But when police started speaking with people who actually knew the Bartlium family, friends, neighbors, extended family, and even Jackie's partner Simon, a very different picture began to emerge. Daniel and Jackie didn't have a close, loving bond. In fact, it was the opposite. Their relationship was volatile, regularly tense. People who had spent time around them said Daniel would scream at Jackie, start fights with her over the smallest things. He didn't hit her, not physically, from what anyone could tell, but he could be intimidating. He'd get right up in her face, shouting, shaking his fists, using his body to dominate the space. He knew how to push her, and he knew how to manipulate her. Jackie, by contrast, was described as lenient, forgiving. Even after these emotional explosions, she'd always let it go. She'd move on, try to keep the peace. Simon, Jackie's partner, saw all of this firsthand. He watched the way Daniel treated his mother. He saw him rage, confront her, tower over her in fury. And then saw Jackie, later that same night, just let it slide as if nothing had happened. It was a cycle. Simon also noticed how much control Daniel held over Jackie's decisions. Even big ones like moving house had to be run by Daniel first. If he didn't approve, it didn't happen. And Jackie went along with it. Maybe because she didn't want more conflict. Maybe because she was just exhausted. But for Simon, the moment the autopsy results came back confirming that Jackie's cause of death wasn't the fire, but blunt force trauma, something inside him clicked. He said he knew, right then. He knew it wasn't an intruder. He knew it had to be Daniel, because he had watched this boy push further and further for years. And now, it seemed Daniel had finally taken that final step, the one no one wanted to believe he was capable of. But the question remained, where did this come from? To the outside world, to his teachers, classmates, even casual friends, Daniel Bartlium seemed like a completely normal 14-year-old boy. A nice kid, polite enough, quiet, from a decent, well-off family, private school education, clean clothes, loving parents. So how did it end up like this? Daniel was born on the 11th of November, 1996. A completely ordinary childhood. His parents, Jackie and Adrian, were still together then. They were financially stable, loving, attentive. They made sure their children were well looked after. There were no known reports of abuse, no physical violence, no neglect, not even emotional neglect. In short, there was nothing in Daniel's early life that would hint at something this dark waiting beneath the surface. The only event that psychologists could point to, the only possible source of emotional trauma, was when Daniel's parents divorced. That happened when he was around 8 years old. Now, Jackie and Adrian had done everything they could to make the transition as smooth as possible. They kept things civil, they focused on the kids, they tried to keep life normal. But even the cleanest divorce can leave emotional scars. Psychologists suggested that maybe Daniel felt abandoned or insecure. That maybe it left him with a deep sense of instability. The idea that everything in life could just fall apart in a moment. That nothing was safe, nothing was permanent, and maybe that did leave a mark on him. But let's be very clear. These feelings, if he even had them, are not an excuse. They're barely an explanation. Millions of kids go through divorce. I'm sure you know people who have. I do too. Most of them turn out just fine. They don't become violent. They don't fantasize about killing a parent. They don't set fire to their own homes. And that's what makes Daniel Bartlem's case so disturbing. There's no clear reason. No single moment you can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. No obvious trauma. No long history of abuse. Just this boy. And a crime no one saw coming. Anyway, it was after his parents' divorce that Daniel's life started to shift, not just emotionally, but practically too. One of the biggest changes was his school. Daniel had been attending a private school, one of the more prestigious ones in the area. But after the separation, Jackie and Adrian could no longer afford the tuition. So Daniel was pulled out and enrolled in a regular state school, and he hated it. He didn't try to hide it either. He was openly against the idea, bitter even. He thought he was above it, above them. Daniel had developed a sense of entitlement early on, even before he hit his teenage years. He carried himself like someone who deserved more money, more control, more respect, like someone who shouldn't have to settle for the ordinary. And that sense of superiority didn't just stop at school. It seeped into every corner of his life. We talked earlier about how controlling Daniel was with his mother, how Jackie had to run things by him before making decisions. And one of the most telling examples of this was when she and Simon started seriously considering moving in together. By this point, Jackie and Simon had been in a relationship for about 3 years. Things were solid between them. They wanted to take the next step, sell their individual homes, buy a bigger one together, and become a full household. A fresh start. So they began house hunting together. But every time they found a place they liked, every time they felt hopeful, they'd bring Daniel along to see it. And every time Daniel said no, he didn't like it, didn't approve. And just like that, the deal was off. It didn't matter how much Jackie liked the house. It didn't matter how excited Simon was. If Daniel didn't want it, it didn't happen. And Jackie, she listened to him. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't want happiness for herself, but because she wanted her sons to be okay. She wanted their lives to feel stable, safe. She wanted their next chapter to begin with a sense of peace, not resistance. After all, Daniel and Dominic were still so young, and she didn't want to make a major change that would make them uncomfortable. It came from a place of love. But Daniel, he wasn't acting from love. This was manipulation. He wasn't saying no because he genuinely disliked those houses. He was saying no because he didn't want things to change. He liked his life the way it was, the house, the routine, the control. He didn't want to move. He didn't want Simon there permanently, and he knew how to stop it. So here was a boy, just 13 or 14 years old, effectively controlling his mother's entire life, her relationship, her home, her future. If he didn't approve, it didn't happen. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Let's take a step back to when Daniel was around 10 or 11 years old. At school, Daniel didn't really have many friends, but from all accounts, it didn't seem like he wanted them either. He was a loner, quiet, kept to himself, detached. And it wasn't shyness, it was superiority. Daniel carried himself like he was better than the other kids, like friendships weren't worth his time. He had a kind of attitude, a superiority complex, that made it seem like no one around him was on his level. So, most of his social life happened at home. His entire world revolved around 3 people: his mother, his stepfather Simon, and his much younger brother Dominic. But even then, Daniel didn't seem to connect deeply with them. Especially Dominic. There was an 8-year age gap between the 2 boys. When Daniel was 12 or 13, Dominic was just 4 or 5, still a toddler. So there wasn't much they could do together. They didn't share interests or hobbies. They weren't equals. And despite being so much older, Daniel wasn't kind to his little brother. In fact, he was known to be physically rough with him. Daniel always dismissed it as play fighting, just boys being boys, just harmless brotherly behavior. But the reality was different. This wasn't playful, this wasn't fair. This was a teenager already entering adolescence, pushing, pinching, and digging his knuckles into the ribs of a child who was barely out of nursery. Dominic never did anything to provoke it. He was 4. He didn't argue, he didn't instigate, and Daniel, he made sure to only act this way when Jackie wasn't looking, because he knew it wasn't okay. But Simon noticed. He caught Daniel in the act more than once, saw how he waited for moments when their mother was distracted before lashing out at his brother. And as Daniel grew older, things only escalated. By the time Daniel was 12 or 13, the way he spoke to Jackie became more aggressive. It had always been there, a cheeky tone, occasional talking back, but now it had evolved into full-on confrontations. He would get up in her face, wave his fists around, shout her down. Simon remembered one time in particular. Daniel had cornered Jackie during an argument, standing inches away from her, yelling, fists clenched, and Simon had to physically step between them, had to pull Daniel back because Jackie was scared. And all of this, it wore her down. She was trying to raise 2 boys, and it was draining her emotionally, mentally. The constant tension, the unpredictable outbursts, the fear of escalation, it left her exhausted. She wanted to discipline Daniel. She wanted to set boundaries. But she was so worn down that at a certain point, she just couldn't. She'd tell herself, just let him get it out. Let him scream. Let him calm down. Because trying to stop him felt like it would only make it worse. If she confronted him, what would happen? Would he hit her? Would he scream louder? Would he destroy something? She didn't know. So she chose what felt like the safest option. She stood there, took it, waited for the storm to pass, and then hoped it wouldn't come again tomorrow. Jackie deep down was really hoping that all of this, the anger, the mood swings, the outbursts, was just a phase. She thought maybe it was just Daniel becoming a teenager, hormones, growing pains, a rough patch that he'd eventually grow out of. But Simon saw something different. To him, this wasn't just a teenage phase. These were genuine red flags, serious ones. Behaviors that went beyond moodiness or rebellion. He could see signs of something darker, something that needed attention, and he tried to raise the alarm. Simon has since said in interviews that he talked to Jackie about it, that he told her she needed to take it more seriously, that Daniel should speak to someone, that this wasn't just typical teen behavior. But Jackie, already exhausted and overwhelmed, didn't want to stir the pot. She didn't want to cause more confrontation. So she didn't push it, and the red flags continued. Daniel would draw, but not ordinary sketches or cartoons. His drawings were disturbing, graphic, violent. Images of teenagers stabbing each other, faces twisted in rage and pain. And then there were the stories. We already talked about the screenplay, the one where a boy murders his mother. But that wasn't an isolated case. That was just one of many stories Daniel had written on his laptop. And they all followed a similar theme: violence, brutality. In one, a student gets into a fight at school and stabs another. In another, a character kills without remorse. These weren't subtle metaphors or complex emotional pieces. They were murder fantasies, typed out and stored like files. And sometimes, Daniel would even bring those stories downstairs to read them aloud to his family, to Simon and Jackie. They were disturbed. They didn't like them. They'd ask him, "Why are you writing this kind of stuff?" They questioned him. They knew it wasn't right. But even then, Jackie would brush it off, try to rationalize it. She believed it was just Daniel being a teenage boy, going through a dark, edgy phase into horror, exploring the world. She excused it, told herself it was normal, but Simon didn't see it that way. To him, this wasn't just a phase. This was a pattern. This was a boy who was sitting in his room day after day, writing stories about murder, drawing pictures of violence, and immersing himself in darkness. Now, to be fair, Daniel did have other interests too. He liked Doctor Who, Star Wars, science fiction. He had a creative side, but as he got older, turning 13, then 14, those lighter interests faded into the background, and something else took their place. Horror movies, true crime documentaries, 18-plus video games, gore, torture. Daniel didn't just watch this stuff, he memorized it. He had favorite scenes. He'd go back to the Saw movies and watch the same sequences over and over again. He clipped his favorite violent moments and uploaded them to his YouTube channel. Now, to be clear, watching violent media doesn't cause someone to become violent. That's been studied for decades. Most people can watch horror movies and walk away unaffected. They know it's fiction, they know it's entertainment, but with Daniel, psychologists noticed something different. Because this was his entire world. He didn't have much else going on. No real friends, no hobbies outside of home, no extracurriculars. His only social contact was with family, and even that was limited. Daniel would come home from school, retreat to his room, and disappear into this world of horror and gore. Even at dinner time, he'd avoid the family table. He'd go downstairs, grab a plate, and take it back upstairs where he'd sit alone, eating dinner while watching the same violent scenes over and over again. It became his reality. And while most of us can watch a horror movie and know it's not real, when that's all you consume every day with no contrast, it's easy to lose that sense of separation. For Daniel, the world of violence was his normal. He didn't recognize it as fiction anymore. Like I said earlier, Daniel wasn't just obsessed with horror movies, he also had a deep fixation on soap operas. And not just the day-to-day drama that most people tune in for. No, he was especially drawn to the dark storylines. The twisted, violent arcs that often pop up in long-running shows like EastEnders and Coronation Street. British soaps are known for that. Among all the weddings and secrets in everyday life, there are sudden murders, fights, explosions, betrayals, and Daniel ate it all up. A big portion of the content Daniel uploaded to his YouTube channel, outside of horror movie clips, came from soap opera scenes, especially ones that featured violence. There was one video in particular on his channel titled EastEnders Greatest Moments. And when people watched it, they quickly realized these greatest moments weren't heartwarming family reunions or emotional plot twists. They were all violence. Every single clip was a different fight, a different murder. Someone being pushed down the stairs, someone getting shot, someone being beaten with a baseball bat, someone thrown from a window. That was what Daniel considered the best of EastEnders. For most viewers, a greatest moments compilation from a soap would include a variety of touching scenes, dramatic revelations, funny exchanges. But for Daniel, greatness was defined by one thing: violence. Psychologists have since studied Daniel's fixation with soap operas, and they found something particularly troubling. They believe Daniel was drawn to shows like EastEnders and Coronation Street because they blurred the line between fiction and reality. Unlike horror movies, which are clearly exaggerated, gory, over-the-top productions, soap operas are designed to feel real. The characters are everyday people. The settings are familiar houses, streets, pubs, markets. It's ordinary life until it's not. And that's where the danger lay for someone like Daniel. Because in these soap worlds, murder isn't shocking, it's just another storyline. It's normalized. And when Daniel saw characters who looked like people he knew, people who were just normal committing violent crimes, it started to shift something in his brain. He began to think, I'm a normal person too. I live a normal life. So maybe I can do that as well. And even worse, in many of these soap opera plots, the killers get away with it. At least for a while, sometimes forever. So now Daniel wasn't just seeing relatable characters commit murder, he was watching them escape justice. And that gave him ideas. One scene in particular stood out to Daniel. It was from Coronation Street, and it was one of his favorites, a scene he'd even clipped and uploaded to his YouTube channel, though it's since been removed. The scene involved a character named John Stape murdering a woman named Charlotte. He killed her with a hammer. And then, in a moment of brutal cunning, he took her body and hid it inside the wreckage of a train crash that had just occurred in the town. So when her body was eventually discovered, it looked like she had simply died in the crash. And just like that, John Stape got away with murder. So this was the kind of content Daniel Bartlam was constantly consuming. Murder, violence, fear. There was nothing uplifting, nothing neutral, nothing even remotely normal. He wasn't watching sitcoms or family movies or documentaries about space or nature. It was all blood, all pain, all death. But a lot of this was happening behind closed doors. It's hard to know how much Jackie or Simon really knew about the media Daniel was watching. After all, most parents don't monitor every single thing their teenager does online. That would be incredibly difficult and frankly, overwhelming. It's likely that Jackie had no idea just how deep Daniel was sinking into this world. She and Simon were aware of some of the strange and concerning things he did, but the full extent, that remained hidden for a long time. Until one day, something was discovered that would completely change how they saw him. It was during a spring cleaning. Jackie and Simon had decided to go through the house room by room to declutter, reorganize, and get rid of anything that was no longer used. They wanted to refresh their space, reset. And as part of that process, they tackled Daniel's bedroom. They cleaned out his drawers, his closet, his shelves, tossing old toys, clothes that didn't fit anymore, things he hadn't touched in years. But when Simon reached the back of Daniel's wardrobe, he stopped. There, hidden in the dark corner, was something deeply disturbing. It was a pile of Jackie's underwear. Her own son, 14 years old, had stolen her underwear and hidden it in his room. And it hadn't just been there for a day or two. These items had been missing for months. Jackie hadn't even noticed they were gone. But it didn't stop there. As they continued going through the room, they made another horrific discovery. Daniel, despite having his own ensuite bathroom, just a few steps from his bed had been urinating and defecating in his toy boxes. Little plastic storage containers filled with Star Wars figures and childhood memorabilia, things Jackie had bought him, were now soaked in waste, human waste, deliberately. And it got worse. After these moments, Daniel would clean himself up using towels, not toilet paper, and then toss the soiled towels under his bed. By the time Jackie and Simon found them, the waste had hardened. The towels had been there for months. It was shocking, revolting, beyond explanation. Naturally, psychologists took a deep interest in this behavior. Because this wasn't something you see every day, not even in deeply troubled teens. It was unusual, alarming, but also important. And two major psychological theories emerged. The first theory was that this behavior was an extension of Daniel's anger toward his mother. The Star Wars toys he was soiling, they were gifts from Jackie. In his mind, they represented her. They symbolized her presence. So by defiling them, by urinating and defecating on them, he was metaphorically attacking her. He couldn't lash out directly, not yet, but he could do this. The second theory, that this was simply a desperate cry for attention, a disturbing, twisted way to be seen, to be noticed, to shake up the silence in the house. And to be clear, no one is trying to make this about Jackie's parenting. It's impossible to comment on what kind of mother she was, especially from the outside. I wasn't there. You weren't there. Even the articles that try to question her decisions, they weren't there either. No one really knows what was happening behind closed doors in that house. But some professionals have suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was an element of emotional neglect in Daniel's life. Not deliberate, not malicious, but real. Especially as he got a little older around the time of the divorce and the birth of his younger brother, and later when Jackie met Simon. Jackie had a lot going on. Her marriage had ended. She was raising 2 kids on her own. She had a newborn to care for. She was trying to rebuild her life emotionally, financially, socially. There were so many moving parts, so many new responsibilities. And Daniel, he wasn't the center of her world anymore. He wasn't the only child. He wasn't the baby. He wasn't the one constantly being held or soothed or focused on. Jackie was stressed, tired, distracted, trying to juggle a life that had shifted under her feet. And perhaps Daniel felt that. Perhaps he felt unseen. And perhaps that was the seed. Psychologists believe this could have been the reason Daniel started acting out, because he wanted his mother's attention, any kind of attention, whether it was good or bad, it didn't matter. If she scolded him for urinating on his toys, that was still engagement. If she yelled at him for writing a violent story, that was still her looking at him, responding, reacting. Maybe that's what he was trying to do, draw her back in, force her to focus on him. And that's why he would read his violent stories aloud to her. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to ask, "Why are you writing things like that?" He wanted her to feel something, anger, concern, anything. And the same theory applies to the underwear. At first glance, it's horrifying. It looks deeply inappropriate, like something sexual, like Daniel had some kind of twisted fixation on his mother. But not all psychologists agree with that surface level interpretation. Some believe that while it might look sexually motivated, it was actually just another cry for attention. Another way to make Jackie notice something, to discover something that would force her to talk to him, to ask questions, to connect. Maybe he knew she'd find the underwear eventually, and when she did, she didn't lash out. She didn't sit him down and talk to him. She laughed it off with Simon, just awkward discomfort, and that was it. She never brought it up to Daniel. Another moment, missed. Another red flag, overlooked. And there was another incident, one that psychologists often come back to that they believe fits into this same pattern of attention-seeking behavior. Daniel ran away. He was about 12 or 13. It was the middle of the night. He had just had another argument with his mother, another shouting match, another night of tension. And this time, he snapped. He left the house, alone, no phone, no plan, just Daniel, walking through the dark streets. Eventually, the police found him walking in the direction of his old house, the one he'd lived in with his mother and biological father before the divorce, before his brother was born, before Simon entered their lives. That was telling, because it wasn't just a random walk. He wasn't just trying to get away. He was trying to go back to a time when life felt simple, when he felt secure, when he had his mother's full attention, when the world hadn't started shifting beneath his feet. And while Daniel was gone that night, the entire community went looking for him. Family, friends, neighbors. Everyone was worried. Everyone was searching, desperate to bring him home. And when he was finally found, he acted like nothing had happened. He just went back to life as normal. One of the most concerning things that came up in my research was what happened in the year leading up to the murder. Around that time, Daniel had started seeing his school counselor. He told them that he was hearing voices that whispered to him all day, every day, telling him to hurt people, telling him to harm the people who had wronged him. They were persistent, constant, a noise in his head that wouldn't go away. And then there was a moment in class, a big public outburst. Daniel suddenly started yelling that his school tie had come to life. He called it Fred, and he said Fred was trying to kill him, trying to strangle him. Now, this type of behavior can be interpreted in a few different ways. Maybe Daniel really was hearing voices. Maybe he was experiencing something serious, something that required professional care far beyond what a school counselor could offer. He might have needed one-on-one therapy, a formal diagnosis, medication, a referral through his GP, an entry into the mental health system that could have given him structure, treatment, and stability. Because if this was a genuine mental health issue, then he needed real help, urgently. But some people, including professionals, have pointed back to that other theory. The theory that Daniel was simply crying for attention. And to be honest, this is always a hard thing to talk about. It's uncomfortable. Because anytime someone claims that another person, especially a child, might be faking or exaggerating symptoms of mental illness, there's a huge risk of doing harm, of contributing to the stigma, of not believing people who actually need help. There's a long, painful history of people not being believed when they say they're hearing voices. especially kids. And the fear is always there that we'll write someone off as attention seeking and miss a real underlying issue. So I want to be clear. It's impossible to say with certainty what Daniel was experiencing. But what people did observe was this. Daniel's outbursts only happened around other people. He would be sitting in class quiet one moment and then suddenly he'd start screaming, pulling on his tie, saying it was trying to strangle him. He'd panic, yell, create a scene. But when he was alone, when he was in his room, there were no reports of these episodes. No panic, no screaming, which is why some psychologists suggested it could have been performance. A way to get attention from teachers, from classmates. A way to create urgency, to shift eyes onto him, even if just for a moment. Again, no one can say for sure. And personally, I won't make any claims about whether or not Daniel was mentally ill because I simply don't know. But some psychologists, when looking at all of his behaviors together, the voices, the classroom outbursts, the underwear theft, the urinating on his toys, the violence toward his brother, they started to see a potential pattern, some kind of underlying disorder, maybe something like borderline personality disorder, maybe something in the realm of schizophrenia. Whatever it was clear that something was very wrong. But Daniel Bartlum never received the proper professional help to explore that further. His school recognized the signs. They flagged them. They urged Jackie and Simon to take him to a doctor to get him evaluated. But Jackie and Simon, they didn't believe he was hearing voices. They didn't think it was real. And so they never took him. Because in their minds, it was just another cry for attention. Eventually, Jackie and Simon did take Daniel to the doctor. He was referred for therapy and had a few sessions, maybe 2 or 3 at most. During that time, he was seen by a psychiatrist. And after those brief encounters, that psychiatrist came back to Jackie and Simon with a conclusion. He didn't believe Daniel was actually suffering from any mental illness. And just like that, Daniel was disregarded by the mental health services. No further intervention, no long-term therapy, no deeper evaluation, it all stopped. Looking back, that decision would prove to be a fatal one. Because the truth is, whether Daniel was genuinely hearing voices or not, even if it was all just a cry for attention, that cry should have been heard. If a child is so desperate for emotional connection that they resort to making up stories about voices telling them to hurt people, that alone should be reason enough to be seen by professionals. Because there's always a reason behind attention seeking. Maybe they're not getting enough love. Maybe something inside them is breaking. Maybe underneath it all, there's a mental illness beginning to show itself. In Daniel's case, he should have been seen, and he wasn't. But now we come back to the timeline. 14-year-old Daniel Bartlum is in police custody, arrested on suspicion of murdering his own mother. At this point, he's being held while investigators continue building their case. They still don't have direct proof. No confession, no forensic evidence. All they have are circumstantial pieces. The argument heard by the neighbor, the disturbing screenplay on his laptop. But none of that, not even the most damning fiction, is proof that he acted on it. To take this to trial, police need something stronger. They need forensics like blood on Daniel's clothes, or his DNA on the handle of the hammer, or they need a confession. So for the time being, Daniel was held in a youth offender institution, a temporary holding place while everything was sorted. But he didn't settle in quietly. He was argumentative, angry, volatile. He got into fights, a lot of them. But there was one fight in particular that changed everything. It was with a teenage girl in the same facility. The altercation turned physical. Staff had to intervene, pulling the two of them apart. And as they dragged Daniel away, he shouted something that couldn't be unheard. I could kill her just like I killed my mom. It wasn't official, but it was enough. Police already suspected Daniel. They already believed he was responsible. But now they had an unofficial confession. It couldn't be used in court, not directly, but it gave them something powerful, leverage. So they brought Daniel back in, Saturday him down in the interview room, and confronted him with what he'd said. And this time, Daniel didn't deny it. He knew the game was over. And there, across the table from investigators, Daniel Bartlam gave his official confession. He told them that he had murdered his own mother, Jackie Bartlam, after a particularly heated argument. He said it wasn't random, that she had called him something that cut deeper than anything else. She had called him a fucking freak. According to Daniel, that word freak was one Jackie used often. She knew it hurt him. She knew it struck at the most fragile parts of him. His isolation, his insecurities, his lack of friends, the fact that he didn't fit in, and when she said it that day, something in him snapped. He told officers that he had spent the entire day a Sunday alone in his bedroom. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't done anything else. Just sat and watched horror movies, specifically the latest installment of Saw at the time. He watched all of them, back to back. That was the only information, the only stimulus entering his brain all day. Blood, violence, torture. And by the time the argument happened that evening, he was already in a dark, violent state of mind. And when that word came, freak, Daniel said that something went wrong in his brain. He said that he had finally had enough. He was done. So Daniel left his bedroom. He walked out to the garden, to the shed. He opened the door, stepped inside, and grabbed a claw hammer, the very same kind of weapon used in countless scenes from the horror movies he loved. And then he went back inside the house. He walked into his mother's bedroom, where Jackie was now lying in bed, and without hesitation, he raised the hammer and struck her over the head, once, twice, again, and again, until he had hit her about 8 times. There was no pause, no hesitation, no mercy. Once Jackie was dead, Daniel didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He didn't reconsider. Instead, he began wrapping his mother's body in newspaper carefully, deliberately, because he wanted to make sure she was as flammable as possible. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every step was calculated. He had already planned it all in his mind, not just that he would kill her, but how. He'd imagined this moment for years, and now he was finally doing it. He was calm, focused, efficient. He finished wrapping the body, then went and got petrol. To this day, no one knows exactly where he got it from. Even police weren't sure, but somehow he had it. And he doused her, her body, the bed, the room, everything. But then in a moment that makes this entire story even more chilling, Daniel didn't set the fire right away. Number. Instead, he went to take a shower, because by now he was probably covered in blood. So he walked into the bathroom and calmly washed himself. His mother was lying dead, soaked in petrol, in the next room. His 6-year-old brother was asleep in the house, and Daniel was just taking a shower, like nothing had happened. After he cleaned himself, he got dressed. Fresh clothes, dry hair. Then he walked back into his mother's bedroom and set the fire. The flames took hold fast, the newspaper, the petrol, the bedding, all igniting with terrifying speed. Once the fire had started, Daniel walked to his little brother's room. He picked him up, walked him outside to safety, and then went back inside again to get the family dog. And when the authorities arrived, when the neighbors came out, when the fire trucks and police surrounded the house, Daniel played the victim, the hero, the older brother who had saved his little sibling from the fire. And in his confession to police, Daniel tried to frame it all as a spur-of-the-moment decision. He said it wasn't planned, that the argument with his mother had sent him into a frenzy, that he was overwhelmed with emotion, that he just snapped. But what Daniel didn't realize was that the police already knew better. They had already found his laptop. They had already recovered the deleted screenplay, the one he had tried to erase, but failed to completely destroy. And in that script, he had detailed everything, step by step, everything he had done, everything he planned to do. This wasn't some heat of the moment outburst. This was premeditated. He had fantasized about it, planned it. I wrote it. And in the end, he didn't hesitate for a second when the moment finally arrived. Because Simon Matas, Jackie's partner, was out of town. He was working in a different city. And for Daniel, This was his chance. During Daniel Bartlem's trial, his defense team came forward with a strategy. They tried to argue that his mother, Jackie, had been neglectful and possibly even emotionally abusive. They claimed that Jackie was manipulative, that she didn't give Daniel the attention he needed or deserved, that when he began showing clear signs of possible mental illness when he said he was hearing voices and having violent thoughts, she brushed it off, ignored it, delayed medical help. The defense emphasized that Daniel only got 2 short counseling sessions, and then Jackie gave up, that she didn't fight to get him more professional support, that she didn't take the concerns seriously. It was a bold argument, one meant to shift the narrative, to soften Daniel's responsibility, to paint him not as a cold, calculating killer, but as a troubled child failed by a careless parent. Now, to be clear, none of us really know what happened behind closed doors. There are 2 very different stories being told here. Jackie's family and loved ones describe her as a devoted, loving mother. They say she was doing her best, that she was kind, that she tried. But Daniel and his legal team said the opposite, that she was cold, unavailable, that she emotionally neglected him and dismissed his needs. And the truth? It's likely somewhere in between. Because, as people often say, there are 3 sides to every story. One side, the other side. And the truth, what I can say is this. From my research, I didn't find any concrete evidence of intentional neglect or abuse on Jackie's part. Nothing that was documented, nothing that was reported. But again, that's based on what's publicly available. I wasn't there, and neither were you. Meanwhile, Daniel was now facing the possibility of a first-degree murder charge, the most serious possible outcome. And his defense team knew that. So they worked hard to try to reduce it to second-degree murder. The difference between the 2 charges comes down to premeditation. If the murder was planned in advance, calculated, it was first degree. But if it happened in the heat of the moment during a burst of emotion, then it would fall under second degree, a lesser charge, a shorter sentence. So Daniel's barrister stood up in court. He started asking a line of carefully crafted questions. Questions designed to show that this wasn't planned, that it wasn't premeditated, that Daniel had simply snapped that night, and then came the crucial moment. The barrister asked him directly, "Did you plan in advance to kill your mother that day?" It was a setup. The barrister was hoping Daniel would say no. That way, the defense could push for second-degree murder, show that it was an impulsive act, not a calculated one. But Daniel's response was not what anyone expected. He didn't say no. Instead, he said something much more chilling. He said, "I wasn't planning to do it that night." He didn't elaborate. He didn't clarify. But that answer spoke volumes. Because what that statement implied, at least on the surface, was that Daniel had always known. That deep down, he believed that one day he would end up killing his mother. Maybe he hadn't circled a date on a calendar. Maybe he hadn't thought that day would be the day. But in his mind, it was inevitable. This was how their story would end. And it makes you wonder, what if they hadn't argued that night? What if Jackie hadn't misplaced those shoes? What if that particular spark had never been lit? Would Daniel have waited another week? A month? A year? Would Jackie still be alive today? Or would he have just found another excuse? Another moment to blame? Because from everything the jury heard, from his deleted screenplay to his search history to his own confession, it became clear that Daniel wasn't some kid who just lost control one night. He was waiting for his moment, and when it came, he acted on it. During the trial, Daniel's defense argued hard. They pushed the narrative that he was a neglected, abused child, desperate for love and understanding, that Jackie had failed him as a mother, that she ignored his cries for help. But the jury didn't buy it, because they had heard the evidence. They'd seen the script he wrote, the step-by-step murder fantasy where the victim had his mother's name. They'd seen the internet searches how to get away with murder, how to burn a body. They had seen everything. And when the time came to decide, they found Daniel Bartlem guilty of first-degree murder. Because this was not a moment of emotional overwhelm. This was premeditated, planned, deliberate. Because Daniel was a minor at the time of the killing, his sentence came with a minimum term life in prison, with at least 16 years to be served before he could even be considered for release. Had he been older, that number would have been much higher. And just before Daniel was led out of the courtroom that day, he turned to Simon Matas, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, and made a chilling gesture. He dragged his finger across his throat. A silent message, "You're next." Simon would later speak about that moment in interviews. He said that it confirmed everything he feared about Daniel, that this wasn't just a one-time thing, that Daniel wasn't remorseful, that the darkness inside him was still there waiting. Simon said he fears for his own safety, but even more than that, he fears for society. He believes that if Daniel is ever released, he will kill again, and the person he's most worried about? Dominic, Daniel's little brother. Simon said there was always a strange hostility between them. Daniel would lash out at Dominic at every opportunity, shove him, intimidate him, use any excuse to be rough with him. Maybe he saw Dominic as the one who stole their mother's love. Because once Dominic was born, Jackie's attention was split. Her time, her energy, her world wasn't only Daniel's anymore. And maybe Daniel never forgave that. Maybe, even now, that resentment is still there, simmering under the surface. Hopefully, Daniel Bartlam will never be released from prison. But if he is, what happens then? What if he's still holding on to that grudge? What if he's still imagining a way to finish what he started? And something worth noting here, something that speaks volumes, is that throughout the course of this trial, Daniel was assessed by multiple professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health experts, and none of them diagnosed him with a mental illness. Despite the stories he told, the voices he claimed to hear, the outbursts, the theatrics, in the end, they all came to the same conclusion. Daniel Bartlam was not mentally ill. He was, in their view, just crying for attention.